welcome you to Palisades Village. I'm Andrea Sakosha. I'm the executive director, and it's so nice to see everyone, not only our own community in the audience, but also some of our village members and also people in our surrounding Palisades community. So welcome. Just so you know, this event will be recorded. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have trouble hearing what we have say, there is closed caption on the bottom of your screen. So hopefully that will help you to have a better experience on this. We have a great program in store for you tonight as part of our author series that is brought to you by the hard work of our Palisades Village Events Committee. And I'd like to introduce one of those members of the Events Committee. She is also one of our founding members. She's on the board and she's a wonderful volunteer. Janet Bollinger, who some of you see on the screen, Janet B, is considered one of Palisades Village ambassadors. She meets her neighbors by walking around the neighborhood with her dog, Leo. And I was really surprised. I'm sorry, I thought, Len, that you and Janet were acquainted by Leo, but I know that now you'll become fast friends. But tonight, we're going to have Janet do the honors of introducing our keynote speaker. Janet, take it away.
All right, thank you, Janet here, and I'm happy that we've all gathered, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Len Downie Jr. He is the Weil Family Professor of Journalism, Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications. He was the executive editor of the Washington Post from 1991 to 2008. During his 44 years in Washington Post newsroom, he also was an investigative reporter, editor of the local national news staffs, London correspondent, and from 1991, managing editor under then executive editor Benjamin Bradley. As deputy Metro editor from 1972 to 74, he helped supervise the newspaper's Watergate coverage. He oversaw the newspaper's coverage of every national election from 1984 through 2008. And during his, before this time, he received his bachelor's and master's and honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degrees from Ohio State University. He is author of 6 books, including The Muckrackers about investigative reporting, The News About News, American Journalism in Peril with Robert G. Kaiser, The News Media, What Everyone Needs to Know with C.W. Anderson and Michael Schutzen, The Rules of the Game, a novel about politics and journalism in Washington. And he just told us before the event that some of the takes place on Potomac Avenue in our Palisades. He's also the author of the Obama administration and the press, published by the Committee to Protect Journalists in 2003, 2013, and co-author with Columbia University professor Michael Schutzen of the Reconstruction of American Journalism. His 7th book, a memoir all about the story, News, Power, Politics, and the Washington Post, is published by Public Affairs, and it was published in September 2020. Mr. Downie is a founder and former board member of Investigative Reporters and Editors, Inc., and current chairman of the Board of Advisors of Kaiser Health News. He lives with his wife, Janice, in Washington, D.C. So I present Len Downie. Thank you.
We seem to have lost Len for a moment.
Oh dear.
There he is.
Sorry, I'm back now. I don't know what happened. Everybody else there?
We're all here.
Yes, and I'm sorry if you missed it. I did read the introduction,
That's
so
fine. Then you don't need to do it again.
well, you want to hear it again?
No, that's not necessary. I'll get
So
started.
I
I don't
introduced
know if it was
Len.
on my end or what, but I'm sorry that I was gone for a while.
All right, well, here's to Len Downie. Thank you.
Okay, so here I am. So it's a good time for me to talk about this. First of all, I'm a Palisades resident. My wife and I have been living on University Terrace just off Loughborough Road now for since 1997. We've seen a lot of changes around us as older houses in our street get torn down and new ones get built. And but we want to stay here, and our house is not going to be torn down and something built here until we're gone. And we love this neighborhood and everything about it. I wrote this book. This is my 7th book, all about the story. And I, I wrote it because I wanted, for several reasons. Number one, I wanted people to know what really goes on in a newspaper newsroom or a newsroom. Right now, particularly at this time when there's so much confusion over what's fact and what's fiction, and whether or not journalism is honest or not. And I wanted to show people exactly how we go about doing journalism, how I made decisions as the executive editor of the Washington Post. And so that was one reason. Secondly, I was fortunate enough to live through a lot of interesting history and got involved as a journalist in a lot of interesting history from Watergate and before all the way through 9/11 and the beginnings of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And thirdly, because my life story is kind of interesting. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Cleveland, as I was just saying to one of you earlier on. And I was the first in my family to go to college, which I was only able to do because I had excelled in journalism in elementary school, believe it or not, and in junior high school and high school, and wound up with a journalism scholarship to The Ohio State University. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So I wanted to be a journalist since I was 11 years old. I think my dad before me would have liked to have been a journalist, but he came of age during the Depression. He could not go to college. He had to start working right away. One job led to another. He was involved in sales, so he wasn't able to do it. So I felt encouraged by him in pursuing this profession. I had a terrific director of the School of Journalism at Ohio State. His name was George Kinzel, who died of cancer not long after I graduated. But before then, he had arranged for me to come to the Washington Post to kind of shadow Post journalists and report back to him. This was after I graduated, before I was going to get my master's degree, to report back to him on what the possibilities were for having a Washington Center for the School of Journalism at Ohio State. The editor that he had talked to about this at the Post, a man named Ben Gilbert, didn't remember that. I came here. I was already married. I had a child, and we got an apartment out in Riverdale, Maryland, for 3 months for the summer for me to do this. And I was expecting that the Post was going to pay me to do this after this agreement with Kinzel. When I went into that editor's office, Ben Gilbert, as I say in my book, he had not heard of me, or he didn't remember. He told me that he had gotten so drunk at that dinner, he doesn't remember anything that happened there. And so I said, well, that's a problem. And see if they'll bring you on. And the Post was expanding rapidly then. It was a really great financial time for the Post. So they did take me on, and I became an accidental summer intern, along with, by and large, the sons and daughters of people that the senior editors at the paper knew. So they were mostly people from Ivy League schools and so on. And one of them, whose name was Robert Kaiser, this was his second summer as an intern at the Post. He was a Yalie. This young city editor of the paper named Steve Isaacs saw this ambitious kid from Yale and this ambitious kid from a land grant school at Ohio State University and said, let's have a competition between these two guys and see what happens. And by the end of the summer, we both had 13 stories in the Washington Post at 13 weeks, and we were both hired. And that's how I got started at the newspaper, completely by accident. And then the next accident that came along is that that same city editor had recently covered the local court in Washington. For those of you who are old enough, it was called the Court of General Sessions. And like the courts still are in Washington, it was run by the federal government. But at that time, it was run very badly. It was kind of a backwater for the federal government. The judges weren't very good. The place was a mess. And as it turned out, Ben Bradley, who just started at the newspaper as the editor of the paper, had also covered that same court decades before when he was a young reporter at the Post, before he went off and did other things and then came back to the Post as executive editor. So they decided, let's send this guy Downie down there. I'm only being paid $105 a week. It's not a big investment. And have him look to see what's going on there. The regular court reporter would continue to cover the trials and everything. And I would just nose around to see what we could do about the fact it was such a terrible court. And that led to a year-long project. I made some sources with some of the better judges in the court. I watched what was going on in the courtrooms with the terrible judges, and did my own created my own records for the court because they did not have obviously computerized records back then in order to track what happened to cases and show how many things went wrong with cases in the court. The Post published in 1966, the series, 7-part series on the front page of the Post. And I then got invited to a lunch in the Post with a senior editor and with Ramsey Clark, who was then the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. He just recently died. You may have seen his obituary. He told us that they were very interested in court reform in the Johnson administration, the Lyndon Johnson administration. They were impressed by the series. They checked with their experts and found out that the series was accurate about how terrible the court was. And so he told us they're going to abolish the court as a result of what I revealed. They were going to create a new court. And they asked me if a judge named Harold Green, who was one of the good judges in the court, who had been one of my sources, I quoted him in the articles about some of the things he was doing to try to make the court better, whether he should be chief judge. And I said, wait a minute, I'm 23 years old, and I'm not going to decide who ought to be the chief judge of the next court in Washington. But they did abolish the court. The Congress created what is now the DC Superior Court, built a new building for it, and made Harold Green the chief judge. And as a result of that, I went on to do other investigative reporting about legal issues, about consumer fraud, real estate fraud, all sorts of things like that, until there was a new editor on the metropolitan staff of the Post who thought that my taking all this time to do these projects, which went for months or a year at a time, was wasteful, and so he put me on the city desk. And that was when my next stroke of luck happened, because first of all, I wanted to continue to be an investigative reporter. I didn't want to be an editor, but I discovered that I had talent as an editor. And in fact, I wasn't a very good writer. Like many investigative journalists are not good writers. And I was able to learn a lot about writing by the people that I edited, and I had some facility for editing them. And most importantly, one of my reporters was a young man named Donald Graham, who was the son of Katharine Graham. He was doing various jobs around the newspaper in order to learn everything about the newspaper. He had been a student journalist at Harvard University on the Crimson, so he was actually a pretty talented reporter. He would have been fine if he had spent his life as a reporter. And I was his editor for the 9 months that he was working as a reporter in the city desk, and we got to know each other well. I edited all his stories. And that was a relationship that continues to exist today. So that was another piece of luck. And then I went off later on a fellowship, spent a year because I had a book offer to write a book about criminal courts as a result of my series, which I did, book called Justice Denied. That was my first book. And when I came back, we were just actually when I was in London at the very end of this fellowship, I picked up the International Herald Tribune one morning, and on the front page was a story. Back then, the International Herald Tribune was jointly owned by the Post and the Times, Post and the New York Times. And they printed the stories for both newspapers. And on that front page was a story by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, but was a byline about this break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate. And I was amazed by that. First of all, why would anybody want to break into the Democratic National Headquarters? I didn't think there was a lot of money there. I was surprised that Carl Bernstein was still working at the Post. He was a friend of mine. He was a very talented journalist, but he was a ne'er-do-well in his personal life in terms of borrowing money from all of us and not paying it back, being found asleep on a couch in City Hall when he was supposed to be covering City Hall. Leaving a Washington Post rental car in a garage downtown for months on end at great expense to the Post, et cetera. And then I didn't know who Bob Woodward was because he apparently was hired while I was away. Well, 2 weeks later, I was back in the newsroom as the deputy metropolitan editor, the #2 editor on the local news desk. And the metropolitan editor, Harry Rosenfeld, the same guy who put me on the city desk, was now in charge of the Watergate story because it was a local burglary. And the city editor who then worked, I was under Harry, and then under me was a great city editor named Barry Sussman, and Bob and Carl, he directly edited Bob and Carl. And so I became involved in the chain of command for Watergate stories. And gradually over time, as things happened, Bob and Carl wrote All the President's Men, the book, and Barry Sussman, who went on to wanted to write his own book. And so by the time of the Senate Watergate hearings in early 1973, I was the editor responsible for all of the Watergate coverage, all the Watergate investigations, including editing Bob and Carl every day. Following the resignation of the president in August 1974, I succeeded Harry as the metropolitan editor, did that for 5 years. And I had an opportunity to become the London correspondent. And agreed to do that to get some foreign experience would be useful. That was the only foreign assignment I could take because I have a terrible ear. I'm tone deaf. I can't sing. I can't whistle, and I can't speak foreign languages. So there's only so much you have to learn about British English in order to be able to survive there. So I could handle that. While getting ready for that assignment, for those of you who've read the book know that I was sent to Guyana because one of our foreign correspondents named Charles Krause had accompanied a member of Congress down there to investigate what was going on in this place called Jonestown, where the Reverend Jones had these hundreds of people. And there was a concern in San Francisco about what was happening to these people that had previously lived in San Francisco in this place in the jungle called Jonestown. And I got a call in the middle of the night at 1 o'clock in the morning from the managing editor of the Post, Howard Simons, who said they was afraid that Charles Krause had been killed because people had attacked the plane that landed on the jungle strip on its way to Jonestown. Actually, was supposed to be coming back from Jonestown, we hadn't heard from Krause. We knew the congressman was dead. We knew there were other fatalities, and we hadn't heard anything from Krause. So our very good foreign correspondent, Karen DeYoung, who's still at the paper today, she had a front page byline just the other day on national security issues, was assigned to go down and cover the story. And because I had just recently been a senior editor at the paper on my way to London, I was told to take a suit and go and bring Chuck's body home. Or if he was badly wounded, see to his medical care. So we went on a small plane down to Georgetown, Guyana, the capital. And we had a reservation in the same hotel where Chuck had been staying. Karen had the idea that while we were on our way into town, we should stop and try to call his room and see if he was there. And the line was busy, which was very exciting to us because that meant he was alive and probably working. And we got there and knocked on his door, and he opened the door and he was on the phone dictating a story with a towel wrapped around his waist. And we asked how he was, and he was otherwise not clothed. And he showed us only his waist where he had a flesh wound. And he had been wounded and had played dead on the landing strip, and that's how he survived. And so as a result of the fact that he was alive and well, and Karen had other work to do, she went away, and I wound up being the primary reporter on the Jonestown story, which turned out to be my first foreign assignment. And I learned a lot about how to do that before I went off to London. It was a great time to be the correspondent in London because Margaret Thatcher had just become the prime minister. I covered her campaign. I wrote a story that the Post put at the lead position on the top of the front page about the speech that she gave in Manchester, England, where she said that she was proud to be called an Iron Lady. In fact, that was in the headline of the story, and I believe to this day she became known as an Iron Lady in the United States as a result of my story. I also made it my business to try to travel with some of the, to spend a day here and there with some of the people running for Parliament, and as a result was able to make sources. Something I think I talked about in the book, which was interesting, is that the British press operates entirely differently than the press does here in covering government. They had what was called a lobby system, where the reporters that covered the different parts of government would have these off-the-record briefings once a week with the leader of that department, and never would quote them or anything. The stories were sort of had phrases like "it was learned that" or "it is believed that," instead of actually quoting somebody saying something about what the facts were. And so I impressed on these people that these members of Parliament, these few members of Parliament I got to know, that I would be operating by American rules. I was not part of the lobby. And when I talked to them, I would tell them, if you're on the record or you want to request to be on background, which means that I can use what you tell me, but I won't use your name, that's how I'm going to operate. And as a result, during the Falklands War, many years later, which was another big story I was able to cover while I was there, Margaret Thatcher made the decision with the so-called the small war cabinet she had with the Secretary of Defense, this foreign minister, the defense minister, the foreign minister, her, and I think her chief, and then one other member of the war cabinet. They had an exclusionary zone around the Falklands Island while they were sending their ships down to invade it, and to threaten to sink any ship that was going, any Argentinian ship that was entering the exclusion zone. So she sank a ship, had ordered the sinking of a ship called the Belgrano with thousands of Argentinian sailors on it. And her explanation was it was entering the exclusionary zone, and that's why she made a decision to sink it. But the War Cabinet made that decision. Well, one member of the War Cabinet was one of these members of Parliament I had developed as a source. I took him occasionally out to dinner. He knew about how I operated on American rules. And interesting, a member of the British press who was part of that lobby system came to see me one day because he said, I could not publish this in a British newspaper. I want you to know that that ship was leaving the exclusionary zone. It had gone in by accident and was coming back out of it when Thatcher decided to sink it. And so I called this member of the War Cabinet on background. I said, I'm not going to use your name. You know the rules that I operate by. Is that true? Can you confirm that story? And it was true. And that was, the Post published that story, which no British newspaper had published up to that point. And actually, I was taken on television, the British equivalent of, I guess, sort of 60 Minutes, to be interviewed about that, along with a leading British journalist who castigated me for doing this. He said that no British journalist would have run that story because it might endanger their war effort. And that illustrated for me the dramatic difference between British and American journalism. Also, I got to meet Prince Charles because, again, I did what a journalist should do. I got to know the Queen's press secretary, and I got to know Prince Charles's press secretary. And as a result of knowing him, I was able to make I was becoming president of the American Correspondents Association there, which at that time was quite large. There were a lot of American correspondents in England then, and I was able to schedule a dinner with him, with the American correspondents, a year later. That's how you got on the Prince's schedule, a year ahead of time. And as it turned out, by the time the dinner was held, it was only a few weeks before the royal wedding. At the time that I was put on his schedule, he had not even met Diana. but by the time of the dinner, they were planning the wedding. And it was really interesting to spend that evening with him. Again, I've got that in the book. He, as depicted, he was the person depicted in The Crown. He's clearly uncomfortable with his, at that time, at least with his position in life, knowing that he would not have a real job until his mother died, which is a horrible thing to contemplate. And she's still alive and he still doesn't have a job. He was just very, very awkward about everything, but comfortable in the presence of American reporters because he was outside the British system. We did not call him Your Royal Highness or Sir. And we asked him questions that British journalists would not think to ask him. It had to be off the record in terms of not being able to quote him because of the run up to the wedding, but we were able to use our impressions of him and our stories about him. And I have that in the book. And then I covered the royal wedding inside the cathedral with my top hat and tails, and had a great seat where I was above the main altar and got to see a lot of what was going on, and also got to look out to the right to the audience where there were so many heads of state and royalty in the audience that the Prime Minister Thatcher was back in the 7th row because of protocol. And Nancy Reagan was there representing the president, and that was a fascinating thing to do. And then later on, I got to meet Princess Diana when the Prince and Princess came to the United States after I'd come back home as the national editor of the Post. There was a small reception for them at the British Embassy, and I got to chat with her. And unlike her reputation, I found her to be intelligent, and she asked me good questions about why does the American press cover royalty so different from the British press. You know, exactly what you've been seeing in the interviews with the young prince who's left Britain, and what you saw in the Crown. Quite different way in which the British press operates in covering the royalty. And then came the Falklands War and my climactic interview with Margaret Thatcher when I was leaving to come home. I had a kind of exit interview with her. She granted it because she wanted to send a message to the Reagan administration that the Falklands War, which was nearing an end but still not over, the Reagan administration, because both Argentina and Britain were allies of the United States, they were trying to settle the war, and where she was determined to have an unconditional surrender from the Argentinians, and she was determined to invade the islands. And so her interview with me was to convey that message to Washington. It was a very hot day in Downing Street, as I describe in the book. Hot day meaning in the 80s in Britain, and no air conditioning in Downing Street at that time, just the two of us in a little anteroom, sitting very close to each other, facing each other. And as was her way, and I knew this was her way because I'd been a part of other press conferences with her, she argued with many of my questions and sort of on the edge of her seat, and I would be on the edge of my seat defending my questions. We both started sweating a lot. It was a very, very interesting experience. And she gave me really good answers about the war. And the interview was only supposed to last 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And we just kept going because she was so wound up. And I was able to ask her lots of other things. And as I tell my journalism students nowadays, I saved for last the question that might end the interview, because I knew that you sometimes got angry at questions you didn't like. And so my last question was, you're the first woman prime minister of Britain. You're the first woman leader of the Conservative Party, which is known for not being very friendly to women. And when I talk to women during the 3.5 years I've spent in Britain, they all are great, admiring of the fact that there's now a woman prime minister, but they all ask, why aren't there more women in your cabinet? Why aren't you doing things to advance women elsewhere in Britain? And she got right on the edge. She pushed her head up about as close to mine as she could without touching me. And she said, I earned it, they can earn it. And I said, thank you, Prime Minister. And it was just a wonderful moment. I got to see her a couple more times in the years after that with other correspondents at the paper when I was managing editor. And always found conversations with her to be really interesting, and for her to be incredibly frank, very unlike other politicians, always speaking her mind, really interesting. Then was national editor of the paper. In 1984, I supervised the coverage of that presidential election, and I wound up either as managing editor or executive editor, obviously supervising overall every other election through 2008, attending all the political conventions for all those elections and all the inaugurations and so on, which has also been a wonderful part of my career. All during this time, I encouraged investigative reporting. Because I think it's the most important job that American journalism does. I can talk more about that if anybody wants me to. And the Post won many prizes for its investigative reporting during my time. It's not really about the prizes, it's about the impact of a lot of that investigative reporting and the changes that were made as a result of a lot of those investigations. I retired as executive editor in 2008, towards the end of 2008, and talked to a number of universities who were interested in working there, and wound up deciding to go to the Cronkite School in Arizona State University in Phoenix, because it's such an outstanding journalism school, and because they made a great offer to me where, while I would be a full-time professor, I would only spend one semester in Phoenix and the rest of the time in Washington, because I did not want to leave Washington permanently. And that's what we did for a number of years, for about 8 years. And then more recently, after ASU opened a Washington Center downtown here at 18th and K, I was able to teach from here. And of course, during the COVID emergency, I've been teaching by Zoom from home. And continued to be on the faculty. And I wrote a number of other books during the years about various subjects. One of them about investigative reporting called The New Muckrakers. One with my former colleague and good friend Bob Kaiser about the future of news some years ago, and the future of news has already changed a lot since then. And so more recently, with a couple other co-authors, wrote another book about changes going on in the news currently. I've written 2 different reports for the Committee to Protect Journalists on presidential administrations and the press. One about the Obama administration and the press, how controlling that administration was over its message, despite the fact he promised to be the most transparent president in history, he was not. And then another about the Trump administration, and of course the attacks that Trump had on the press and on the facts, on facts generally. Both of those published, you can find them at cpj.org if you're interested in reading them. And now I'm working on what will be a report on the first year of the Biden administration and the press, also for the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I'm trying to, I've got some ideas for some more books to write. So I'm 78 years old, but when everybody says, what's it like to be retired? I get indignant and I say, I'm not retired, I'm working. Please ask questions.
Well, I'm Carolyn, and you've
Hi.
already answered one of my questions. I was going to ask you how much you miss the life of an editor, of a journalist, of a working journalist, not just teaching, but do you
Right.
miss it?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question. Well, first of all, while teaching for those first 8 years, I also, while teaching, ran an investigative reporting project. That students doing national investigation of subjects like voting rights, the coming of marijuana legalization, hate in America. I think we were way ahead of the rest of the press in many cases with some of these projects. And we made sure they were professional standard. And as a result, we're being published by newspapers around the country and websites around the country, including the Washington Post. So I was still engaged in journalism at that time. And now that I'm here, I can't do that anymore. My former colleague who worked with me on it is now running that and doing a good job. But I'm still an advisor to I teach investigative reporting for something called at Cronkite called the Howard Center for Investigative Reporting, which is only 2 years old now. And they also do an investigative project each year. And so I'm an advisor to the executive editor for that project. But that's the closest I get to it. But to come back to the beginning of your question, I miss the newsroom a lot. Of course, now it's different. It's in a different building, and it's all high tech, and there a lot goes on there that I do not understand. All the digital stuff, and so I don't wish I was there, because I know I would have a hard time doing what I should be doing. The fellow who just left the job of executive editor, Marty Barron, did a great job of that, and managed that very well. And now they're searching for somebody else who can do that well. So in that case, I mean, I know I don't belong there anymore. I am sometimes nostalgic for it. I mean, there are stories going on right now, for instance, that I can't read enough, and I'm tempted to call up the national editor and say, how come the New York Times beat you on that part of the Gates story, for example, and or to congratulate them on, oh, you were ahead of them today. That's great, But I try to just leave them alone.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have one.
Go ahead.
All right, I'm Pat Simpich, somebody in the neighborhood,
Hi.
and a friend of Jan Wentworth, who said, oh, he'll really be good to listen to.
Hey, good.
I'm asking an internal kind of question. When you have covered policies, have you ever changed your mind, meaning this is the only one that comes to mind, meaning say you didn't really believe in or approve of Obamacare, but perhaps you changed your mind.
Wow.
That's just the one I think of. I'm not asking about Obamacare.
I understand. That's a great question, and it's something that I left out of my presentation, which is that it was very important to me to be completely nonpartisan. It comes naturally to me to see both sides or all sides of everything. It drives my wife crazy. She's a liberal Democrat. She's got very strong opinions of things, and when she's spouting one of these off, I'll say, "Yeah, but did you think of this?" And she'll say, "Stop it! I hate when you do that." But it comes natural to me. So when I became managing editor, during the 24 years I was either managing editor or executive editor, when I became managing editor, Ben turned over the daily newspaper to me. So I decided then I'm not going to vote, and I'm not going to take positions on any issues or any politicians. And that's hard for people to understand. I've been criticized. I was criticized back then for not voting, criticized in print by some people because I would write about the fact that I didn't vote, and that I wanted to be completely nonpartisan. So I didn't have positions about those things, and I still try not to. I mean, some of the positions that I've taken have to do with journalism and democracy, and so you'll see that in those things that I wrote for the Committee to Protect Journalists. You see that in my book, where I do take positions on not lying and being transparent in government, government being held accountable. But in terms of what policy ought to be for Obamacare or abortion or the national
climate change, the
Right.
border, whatever.
Right. I just don't take positions. And it's interesting because people knew this about me. And so when I retired, I decided at least I can vote. And particularly in the District of Columbia, I registered as non-party. So I can't vote in the primary anyway. So I just get to vote in November. I don't get to do very much. If there's somebody I don't like on the city council, I'll vote for my son instead. That's about as far as I can go on that. So on the day of my retirement became official, my wife registered me to vote online in the District of Columbia, non-party. And the next day I signed the proper form for it. But by the next day already, there was put things on websites saying Len Downie is registered to vote. So people were watching me. And I think they still watch me today. And so today I'm still not going to take positions on things.
But your heart, did it change, I guess? You're definitely not going to take positions outside your journalistic
Right.
sphere, but your heart or your,
my heart has to do with accountability. That's so important to me. My whole life has been devoted to accountability, holding government and everything else in our society accountable to the rest of us. That's extremely important. And lying. I hate lying. I mean, the truth is extremely important to me. So that's where my heart is. So that's where I get exercised about things is when I see lying.
Thank you.
John,
Len, I have a question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
John was trying to unmute.
Oh, I have a question, Len.
Okay.
During your time as an investigative reporter, what challenges has the legal system brought to your investigative reporting?
Right. And somebody just asked a question about the Pentagon Papers. I had no role in the Pentagon Papers because I was on the city desk at the time, and that was being handled by Ben Bradley and the national staff. So I just watched what was going on. But the important thing about the Pentagon Papers, of course, was the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that you could not stop news media from publishing something in advance. You could punish them afterwards if you want for libel or anything you want to try to do to them, but you can't stop them in advance, so-called prior restraint. And so that's extremely important about the role of the accountability journalism, investigative reporting, is that the government nobody can stop us in advance from publishing something that's important. And investigative reporting has been really was changed by Watergate, something also I didn't talk about earlier. Until the Pentagon Papers in Watergate, there was not very much investigative reporting. National investigative reporting. There was local investigative reporting like I had done, but not nationally. Nobody really challenged, the media did not really challenge the government. The Pentagon Papers was the first change in that. And then Watergate and the success of the movie All the President's Men and the book convinced the rest of the media that everybody ought to be doing investigative reporting. And even today, as news media undergoes tremendous economic change, investigative reporting is still very widespread throughout the news media and is extremely important. It's an American phenomenon. Now there are investigative reporting projects all over the world, but they all started as a result of what went on in the United States.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi, Jeff.
I am still mightily disturbed by the fact that by the impenetrability of those who believe the election was stolen.
Sure.
Do you have any comment on that and how one can make some kind of inroads to that? It seems to me it's so dangerous for democracy.
Right. It is definitely dangerous for democracy. And that goes back to my concern about lies. And, obviously it's the result of Trump's lies and the lies of the politicians who are so afraid of his impact on the Republican base, that part of the Republican base, that they go along with the lie. And I don't know what can be done about it except to outweigh it, except to have the Biden administration show that by telling the truth, even if you continue to believe that maybe he wasn't properly elected, he seems to be a president who's telling the truth and doing things right. And that's probably the best thing that can be done about it. And also for people who are upset about those lies to speak out about them. That's also important. And you can see that in the media, and you can see that amongst many public figures who continue to point out that that is a lie.
There's a question in the chat about how can press improve how the public perceives it?
Right. Good question. First of all, is to just keep doing its job. As Marty Barron, the most recent editor of the Post, always said, do the job as well as you can. Don't make mistakes. Be aggressive. Do reporting that people really believe in. It's interesting because the press has never been popular as such in public opinion polls, going all the way back to when I was a young reporter. We're usually only rated somewhat higher than used car salesmen and members of Congress in public opinion polls. But when the same people are asked, well, what do you think about investigative reporting? Oh yeah, we want that. We want that. We want to know what's going on. We want things uncovered that are going wrong. So just you need to do the job. Second of all, something that we did not do for too long a part of my career, but now is being done more and more, is to be transparent about how the press does its work. If you're relying on 12 sources whose names can't be used in the newspaper, say it's 12 sources and say why their names can't be used and give some description of why they know what they're talking about. If you, what you say in your stories what you don't know, it's sometimes difficult for journalists to say, well, I know this, but I don't know this yet. And I'm seeing that more, particularly when I see journalists interviewed, which is useful, and I'm beginning to see it in stories. To show, in other words, to show our work. That was another reason why I wrote this book, was to show people how we actually did this work. And so they can better understand that Catherine Graham or Don Graham didn't tell me what to publish in the Post. I made those decisions on my own, no matter what they thought. And the book shows that. And nobody was telling us what to publish, as the then President Trump tried to imply, for example. And then lastly, to be more open to the public in various ways. One of the Post's current great investigative reporters named David Fahrenthold, and he's the reporter who first did investigative reporting about the Trump Foundation and about a lot of aspects of Trump's business. He's still doing that today. And one of the ways in which he started doing his reporting was he would write down on a legal pad, here's what I know so far. And he would actually go on Twitter and he'd hold up his legal pad and say, here's what I know so far. And I need to know a lot more. Please help me. And people would help him. He began to get information from the public, and people were able to have a stake in what he was doing and were able to see that he was actually seeking facts and not just making things up. Mary Floto was asked what my thoughts were about the thousands of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And for the first time in her life, she's afraid that our democracy may not survive. Yes, our democracy is definitely under attack, I think. There clearly are people out there who would be very happy with Trump or somebody like him being an authoritative dictator. The country's very divided along many lines, along racial lines, along income lines, and so on. We're going through a transition period where the country's moving from one kind of country to another, a much more polyglot country, and that is some people are very afraid of that. And Fox News has gathered an audience of about 3 million people every night, essentially playing to that fear, and that's very dangerous. But I still believe that the majority of Americans, as we witnessed the election of Joe Biden, and the fact that the audiences for factual news media like the Washington Post and New York Times and the broadcast networks have been growing and not shrinking, shows that that in the end that will be, I think that will be all right. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle between now and then. It's important we all play our roles in that. In terms of the storming of the Capitol, obviously, as the New York Times, I think, has gotten hold of a report that I guess is being released maybe tomorrow, that shows that the Capitol Police and the leadership of the Capitol were very unprepared for what was going to happen, that did not pay attention to the intelligence that was in advance for that. And I assume that they'll be better prepared for that sort of thing in the future. And as awful as it was, and as many people were involved in that as was, it still was a relatively small number of people compared to all the millions and millions in the country. And it's good to see the law enforcement being very, very vigorous in bringing those people to justice. There are well over 300 people charged so far. It was one of the biggest investigations in American history. And I think that will be a helpful deterrent.
We have another question in the chat. Do you see any remedy to the breakdown of local reporting at the city council and school board across the country?
Right, and that's a very good question. And that's my other project, which I don't talk too much about yet because I got to finish the first project first before I can move on to the next one, but I'm making preparations for it. Yeah, local news, national news organizations are doing fine, and they have a big internet audience and so on. You know who they are. But local news organizations across the country are not. They've lost much of their advertising to the internet, and they've been struggling. And some of them are owned by owners who are only by hedge funds who are only taking money out of them and been shrinking their news gathering. And as a result, they've not been able to cover, and some have gone out of business, and others have not been able to cover the news locally the way that they want to and the way that they should. It's a really big problem. There is a movement now to do something about this, a kind of loose movement, foundations and various organizations that have been formed. There's something called Report for America that actually pays to send reporters to local newspapers around the country to work there for a while, as long as those newspapers agree to find a way to raise money to replace them when their Report for America duty is over, sort of like a Peace Corps for journalism. There are a number of nonprofit news organizations that have started up around the country, and foundations and members with memberships like public radio and television have grown up around them. It's still all in its infancy, and I hope in the next couple of years to be able to write something about that will inform all Americans about what's going on there. Didn't Gordon Kidd have a question?
Yes, he did. He said, I recall you met Prince Charles when you worked for the Post in London. Did you meet Prince Philip? And if so, what were your impressions of him?
No, I did not meet Prince Philip, and all the times I saw the Queen was from a distance. I made it my business to make sure that I went to one of her knighting ceremonies. But again, you watch her from a distance during those things. You don't talk to her. I was in receiving lines before the royal wedding for garden parties at the palace, but I was not one of the people she stopped to talk to. You know, she stops and talks to like every other 10th person, and I was not part of that. So it was Charles and Diana that I got to know, but not the Queen or Philip.
And he also wants to know, are they hiding Biden to avoid his blunders? Steve Roberts thinks so.
Right. Steve Roberts thinks that. Yeah. Well, not hiding him, but yes, but being careful for him not to be too spontaneous. He only had one press conference so far. He is sometimes available to reporters at other occasions, ad hoc, but otherwise most of his communications have been prepared, or he's reading things that have been prepared. I recognize his language in them, so it's not just that somebody else is running the country and putting words in his mouth. This is him, but he himself is cognizant of the fact that he's made mistakes. Remember, he called himself a gaffe machine some years ago, so he's being careful about that. But also the other side of that coin, and there was a good piece about that I just read today, someplace I can't remember where, is that Trump overdid it. Trump was too evident and had all this crazy stuff on social media, and we don't have to have a president do that. That's not a required part of the job. So I don't worry about that. I worry about whether or not the information is being made available to the press, and that's a concern of mine, and whether or not there's information that's not being made available. One of the things they've done is make other members of the administration much more available, the heads of the departments and agencies, members of the cabinet, which again, the Trump administration did not do because the president wanted to do it himself and didn't want them saying something that he didn't agree with. And so I think that's a good development. So I'm not too worried about Biden's ad hoc availability yet.
And one last question here. Do you have pets?
No, I don't. My wife used to have cats, but when the last one died, because we were traveling back and forth to Arizona, for example, it was just too difficult to have another cat. And I actually like living without a pet myself. I got enough trouble taking care of myself without taking care of a pet.
Right.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Another question. It's discouraging to read the Post and the Times and listen to Fox, and yet I do have friends who are on a different side of the spectrum from me, and I want to get as much information well-rounded as I can. Do you have any suggestions? Do I just read the Wall Street Journal? I mean, the Post and the New York Times being such liberal rags, you know, and depending on who you talk to, Fox News being so terrible in its regard. Do you have some way to pull those things together? Is there some?
Well, obviously, I think you're wrong about the Post.
Of course.
In fact, the editorial page often takes much more conservative positions. If the editorial page, for instance, supported the Iraq War for years, when our reporting was raising issues about it, I think it's a very aggressive newspaper. I like that. I don't think it's liberal. I wasn't liberal when I was running it. I know that Marty Barron wasn't liberal when he was running it. The other thing I didn't do when all those years I was running the newspaper was I would never read our editorial page because I didn't want to be influenced by it. So I think that I'm not going to speak about the Times because we have this rivalry with the Times. But I would suggest that the Post is useful for you in gaining information.
Well, the other side, is there a recommendation?
I think the Wall Street Journal is a good. It has it's obviously aimed at the business community, and its editorial page is conservative, and so that's certainly a more, even though it's also owned by Murdoch, as is Fox. It seems to be the good Murdoch.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions, comments?
There are two questions in the box. One is your opinion of cancel culture.
Yeah, I don't get that, frankly. That's an invention of people on the right who resent, apparently who resent having. I think it's useful that society now cares about race and racial issues and racism. I think it's very useful that we now are hearing from women about how they've been abused and discriminated against over the years, and people that have done that. I don't regard that as cancel. I regard it as in some cases, obviously illegal criminal activity, and in other cases being unfair. And I think that so the cancel culture is a way to, particularly for privileged white men, to try to strike back and stop that. And I just don't agree with that at all.
And we have a question. What are your thoughts about the fact that thousands of people stormed the Capitol?
I already answered that.
I'm sorry. Then the next one, what do you think of The Economist? Is this journalism?
Yeah, it's a certain kind of journalism. It's classic British journalism. It definitely has a point of view. Like I said, I don't believe the Post news pages have a point of view. Certainly they didn't when I was there, because I did not have a point of view. But The Economist, British journalism specializes in having points of view. There are conservative newspapers, liberal newspapers, et cetera. And The Economist is a business-oriented, lowercase conservative, I think, viewpoint. But it's very well written, and it's analytical. It's not really reporting facts so much as it's analyzing things. And I find a lot of its analysis useful. I don't read it regularly because I don't subscribe to it, but I frequently find it in the various newsletters that I subscribe to, things from The Economist, and I find that it seems to be very good at analyzing things that are going on in the world. Very smart people work for it.
And one question from Gordon Kitt. Kamala Harris doesn't seem to have a very high profile.
Yeah, so far she doesn't. I think that's partly by choice. She certainly is very influential. It's clear to me that she's very influential in what's going on. And I think that I can only speculate that because she's a woman and because she's African American and Asian, that they may be concerned that they don't want her to have that high a profile for the people that are prejudiced against that sort of thing. But I don't expect that that's going to continue. And in fact, her profile right now is being raised by her role with immigration. She's going to be making make these trips to Mexico and I think Guatemala in order to try to deal with the source of that immigration. And I think you'll see other instances in which she will increasingly play play a more role. But we're only, we haven't even got through 100 days yet. And it's important for Biden to be seen as the president at this stage. I certainly 100 days in the Obama administration, you didn't see much of the vice president then either. But by the time the administration was over, he was seen obviously in a lot of significant roles, and she now has her first really significant role.
How do you view Jeff Bezos' impact on the Post?
It's been wonderful, and he promised. I was at when he first bought the newspaper. He had a meeting with the news staff, and I went there to. I was invited to join them, and he made clear that he was not going to interfere in any way with the news content or even with the editorial page. Normally, owners are expected to be involved with the editorial page and the newspaper's opinions, but he made clear he was going to be independent of that too. And instead, his connection with the newspaper has been to increase its audience, to increase its income, and to get involved in to enable digital innovation, which it's been a leader in. And so it's now profitable, and as far as we know, and it has a huge audience compared to only the New York Times has a larger international audience than the Washington Post.
Great. Janet, I don't see any more questions. Do you?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed this, everyone.
So
Well,
we.
Just
I
well,
enjoyed it too. And we thank you so
all
much
enjoyed this.
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We can do something in the future after you write another book.
Yes.
Good.
And we look forward to seeing you in the neighborhood as well. So
Good, I
thank you
hope
very
so.
much for this very informative presentation.
Right, my wife and I walk all over the place, so you'll run into us.
Excellent.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, just